by far and large, one of the biggest groundwater hazards is just the fact that we use too much of it. And so overuse of groundwater ends up becoming quite a big problem over time. So one of the first signs of overuse of groundwater is what's known as a cone of depression, which either sounds like something you need some medication for, or it makes me think of Get Smart because they had the cone of silence that they would go into. Maybe I'm just old. I don't know if you've seen Get Smart. So here's a beautiful example of some groundwater. You can see exactly where the water is. You can see the saturated zone, the unsaturated zone, and the water table. So in this case, there's a farmer. He's got 3 wells. Looks like most of what they're using wells for is the one closest to the home. That's probably like their personal use, right? Water, showers, bathtub, drinking, cleaning, that kind of stuff. And then he's got a big empty field. So let's say our farmer decides to plant some crops. And they're going to need to use this next well. So when you take out more water than can fill back in, and that's based partially off of hydraulic conductivity or the permeability, that's a term we used already once, right? And so if you're taking water out faster than it can refill, the water table drops over time. And because it drops the most right around the well, if you sort of imagine this water table in 3 dimensions, it sort of makes a cone shape of the in the water table, and that's why it's called a cone of depression. But what you can see that's happened though are those wells for the home and the secondary well out in the field that used to be able to pump water. Remember the one they used for baths and showers and cooking and stuff? That well has gone completely dry because of the lower water table. This is also referred to as drawdown, and that's usually a sign that you're using water too quickly. You're taking too much out too fast. Now, remember how we talked about the Ogallala Aquifer and their use of groundwater to support their agricultural economy? Well, guess what? Even in the Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona, this happens here as well. So you can see I've given you some sort of a few views here of some of the agricultural areas in and around, at least kind of between Phoenix and Tucson. You can see right through the Eloy and Picacho Basin and just south of the town of Maricopa, there's a whole lot of watering going on there, and that's completely groundwater. Here in Arizona, most of the groundwater usage is for agriculture. Municipal supplies, by far and large, come from surface water, like the Verde River and the Colorado River. An interesting example here is the town of Wilcox. So Wilcox has what's known as a playa. It's a lake that when it rains, water drains into it. It holds some water, and then it dries out over time. So why you see a lot of white around the lake bed at the north part of this image is that's evaporant minerals like halite, like gypsum, that are left behind, and that's really common in playa lakes. But you can see there's a lot of irrigation going on around there too. And you can see there's a link for you here with the name of the town of Wilcox. That'll take you to a story about the groundwater situation here because in the recent years it's starting to get pretty dire. What's happening is there's a lot of corporate farms moving into the area using a lot of groundwater, and it's causing a significant drawdown of the water table. And a lot of the families that have lived there and had small farms for generations, or even folks that have moved recently, what's happening is their wells are going dry, and it's not cheap to dig a deeper well. And so a lot of these families can't afford to get a deeper well done, and there's people going without water, which is pretty wild. So from an AZ Central story about a family that lives in Wilcox, their well went dry, and so they took 5-gallon buckets and a 30-gallon drum, and went to their restaurant that still had water, and they'd fill these 5-gallon buckets up, and the Home Depot orange buckets, I'm sure. They'd fill those up and put them in the back of their truck and drag them home, and that's the water they had at home. That's the water they had for cleaning and showering and doing laundry and cooking. Um, think about every time you use water in your home and what a pain in the ass it's got to be to have to haul it all in. One of the other stories I read about a woman, like literally with gallon water bottles, that she was bumming water off of a friend of hers and taking them home. But that's not the only place that some of these groundwater dropping is happening. So what this map shows you is some of the amount of groundwater decline throughout Arizona. So the darker the red, the more the water table has fallen. So you can see in some of these really agricultural areas, they're using a lot of water. And you can see that down in the Wilcox area. Another place that's gotten a lot of attention recently is Siloam. Um, and that is along the I-10 heading out west. The area just north along the Vicksburg Road exit is some corporate farming there as well. And so these are places that are seeing significant declines in the water tables in those areas. And when you open this particular file up, you can see there's an interactive map for you there too. Yay! So you can actually zoom in and see more of the state as well. But it's not just Arizona, and it's not just the desert. This is a U.S. map. And in this case, you can see that there are some pretty significant groundwater declines because they're having to do deeper and deeper wells in some of these areas. Now, of course, overuse is bad, right? Because you're taking water away, and that water is one of our biggest storage of fresh water on Earth, but it leads to bigger problems. So the biggest problem we face here in Arizona, and actually quite a bit of the rest of the world faces because of groundwater withdrawal, is this process called subsidence. So subsidence is a gradual settling or sudden sinking of the surface due to removal or displacement of subsurface earth materials. That's a mouthful there, sorry. But basically what happens is the elevation of the ground is sinking, and it gets lower and lower and lower over time. Now, most of what this happens because of is groundwater withdrawal. So 80% of subsidence in the U.S. is because of groundwater withdrawal, but it's not the only part. You can also have underground mining. I know West Texas has had some problems with subsidence and sinkholes because of the amount of oil and gas they're removing from the subsurface. You can actually get collapsed like sinkholes. Sinkholes are actually a type of subsidence as well, but they're kind of a little bit out of the realm of what we're talking about here, which is why they're separate. So we can look at the U.S. and places that have significant subsidence problems. The coastal lowlands through Louisiana and Texas, there's a bunch of stuff going on there. So some of that is groundwater extraction. A lot of that is oil and gas extraction along the Gulf Coast there. You also have the Gulf of Mexico is actually it's a subsiding basin, so that's a tectonically driven kind of issue there too. So it's not just groundwater withdrawal. But if we look out west, you can see southern Arizona is covered in these basin range aquifers, and that's where we have a lot of subsidence happening. So all that yellow is basin and range. You can see southern Arizona, California, Nevada, and we're going to mention those places quite a bit throughout this. So what is subsidence? I'm going to show you this video. So Jakarta is the capital city of Indonesia. And obviously they're experiencing some pretty significant subsidence, but it's causing a lot of problems for them. And so there's actually very serious discussion about moving the capital. And you can see where Jakarta is. That's the island of Java. And they're talking about moving it to the northeast over to different a different island altogether. And that's I think that's the Borneo area. I might be wrong. But you can see it's moved pretty far, which is kind of interesting. It's like, the US government declaring that Washington D.C. is a terrible place to be, and they're moving the capital to, western Nebraska or something. So it's moving quite a ways away where not a whole lot of people live, which is a hard part. But they've got lots and lots of flooding there. Now, Jakarta is not the only place in the world that this is happening to. Venice has been in the news quite a bit because Venice is sinking. Even with all of its beautiful, gondolas and stuff, we think of it as a town underwater anyway. But it's sinking due to groundwater extraction at the same time that sea level is rising. So it's causing some major, major flooding issues for them there too. So yeah, Indonesia is moving the capital. Now, if we're going to talk about subsidence, we have to talk about this particular picture here on the left. This is taken in the San Joaquin Valley of California. So this is the southern part of this Central Valley, and you can see where this is on the map to the right. And Mendota is kind of like the poster child for subsidence in the U.S. So you can see this gentleman is standing here next to the power phone lines, next to the pole. At his feet is a sign. This is 1977. What this means is that when this image was taken in 1977, that's the ground surface. That's where he's standing, obviously. However, if you look up that pole to right about the middle of the picture, there's a sign that says 1955. If this picture was taken in 1955, that's the elevation where his feet would be. That's a pretty darn big decrease in elevation, right? Except if you go all the way to the top, you can see a sign for 1925. And in 1925, he would be standing all the way up there. So this pole hasn't been there the whole time. Don't freak out. It's fairly new. They're just using it to put the signs up. But you can see that's a significant drop in the surface of the ground. And you can see what the problem is because there's a big old field right beside him. Now, at this point, they recognized it and they started changing how they use groundwater. So rather than depending completely on groundwater for agricultural purposes, in the San Joaquin Valley, they developed a plan to divert water from the Sierra Nevada mountains. So during the winter, it snows a lot. You get a lot of snow up in the Sierra Nevada. During the springtime, it starts melting and you get melt runoff. And that's about the time they need lots and lots of water for their crops starting to grow. Um, except, except in and around like 2010, 2011, California was in the middle of a big old drought. And they started using a whole lot of groundwater because they didn't have surface water at all. There were some years where there was almost no snowfall during the winter at all. So they had to turn to groundwater. Now, part of the problem is, though, they're growing crops out here now that are different than what they used to. It's still a lot of vegetables. Most of the vegetables that we consume in the United States actually come from the San Joaquin Valley. Um, but because almonds have become so popular in terms of a snack or almond milk or a lot of um, other food products, they're growing a lot of almonds and a lot of avocados out here, both of which require a whole lot of water. And so you can see where some subsidence recently has happened. And there's places throughout this area, in particular, like just north of Mendota and actually just south of there too, where they were seeing subsidence rates that really were pretty close to what they had in the 70s as well. So this is an area that, they slowed it down for a little bit and then kept on trucking and made it a whole lot worse. So why does this happen? Why does the ground sink? Well, again, it's a lot about taking the water out, right? So if you look in the bottom right of this diagram, you have a lot of layers of clay. So when there's nice and wet, the clay sort of holds them up and the water fills in all the gaps between them and they're able to sort of loosely lean up against each other. But as water is pumped out of there, what happens is the clays all sort of start to kind of fall down and they stack up on top of each other. And what that does is it greatly reduces the porosity there. And you're taking up void spaces, and that's got to come from somewhere. And so the ground above it ends up dropping as well. And so you can be like, the ground is lower, right? But this causes some pretty serious damage to their infrastructure, like their electric lines, their phone lines, their water lines, their sewer lines. You don't want to mess with your sewer lines. But when you have, part of your city that drops by 30 something feet, and another part of the city only drops by 20 feet, you're going to break things along the way. You also have increased flooding because now those low areas are places where water is going to tend to drain down to. So anytime you do get rain, instead of, the rain helping and watering your crops, it just drowns them out and you lose those crops. And so it's a big problem. Now, it's not the only reason subsidence happens, though, although it is the major reason. This is showing you mining. Underground mining can cause subsidence as well, and a lot of this is because of collapse. So this is mining in Illinois. And so on the map to the right, you can see where all the rocks of the right age is for the coal are. The black is where you have surface mining and the brown is where you have underground mining. Now, the picture on the left is actually some coal miners. It's a dirty and really, really dangerous jobs. And in particular, these folks working right around the turn of the century were at a particularly high risk. So this is longwall mining. So you can see they dig out so coals end up in a seam. It's just a layer of coal. And so they dig that layer out. And as they move, you can see there's poles holding at the ceiling. Well, they don't care, right? They just leave it behind, take all the coal. Well, if it's not tracked well, if it's not documented, where those mines are eventually get lost. And so there may be underground mines crisscrossing under towns that nobody even knows about. And then over time, those timbers give out and the roof collapses, and eventually the ground does too. This is actually a pretty significant problem in Tombstone here in Arizona because those old mines crisscross all under the town of Tucson, and a couple times a year there'll be some sort of terrible sinkhole. I know they've had to repair Tough Nut Road quite a few times because of that. So if you look, here's a great kind of little diagram showing some of the damage because of mine subsidence. You can see sinkholes, you can see drainage coming from the mines, but in particular, it's a lot of infrastructure, it's a lot of building damage too. And the ground collapsing below you does a doozy on the foundation of your home. This also happens in volcanic areas because the volcanoes are fed by a magma chamber that's buried underground. And so on the left, this is the Sierra Negra volcano. I think that's in Chile. I could be wrong. But what you can see is it's actually sinking, and that's because the lava is draining out of the magma chamber off to somewhere else, and so the ground is sort of slowly dropping, and that is a type of subsidence. On the right shows you subsidence that happens because of megathrust earthquakes along subduction zones. So the top image is where those get locked. Those plates are still moving towards each other, but they're not sliding against one another. So you get some pretty significant uplift on the overriding plate. But when that big earthquake finally happens and everything moves, that part that was uplifted drops down quite a bit. And so a great example is Japan. So Japan had a really big earthquake in 2011. The town of Sendai here is one of the first places that was affected by the tsunami that followed it, the earthquake. But you can see here, this is the before shot. So this is before the earthquake happened, but the same year. You can see green is vegetation and the blue is actually snow. This is a false color image. So this is the before shot and there's the after. So this image was taken right after the earthquake and the tsunami. Now there's some significant flooding along the shoreline. Well, we can assume you're going to have a lot of floods thanks to that tsunami. But part of that flooding is because parts of the shoreline subsided and dropped down. Some of those areas as much as like 4 feet. So the earthquake lasted about 7 minutes. So imagine, you've got this pretty beachfront house and your backyard is basically right at sea level. You walk across the backyard and right into the ocean, which would be awesome, right? And then all hell breaks loose, and there is this massive earthquake that shakes everything around you, which is pretty scary as it is. The shaking happens for 7 minutes. When the shaking stops, you're still standing in your backyard, except now your backyard is 4 feet underwater because it's 4 feet below sea level, and that span of that 7 minutes. And then the tsunami comes. If we look at an image taken a little bit later, you can see there are places that are still flooded out, and those are likely the areas that are going to remain flooded because of that subsidence. It's not just, tsunami water that needs to drain off or dry. So subsidence isn't just something that happens off in Japan. Or California. It's something that happens here in Arizona as well. When subsidence happen, it causes big old cracks in the ground that we call earth fissures. So an earth fissure is a crack that's at or near the surface that are the result of differential subsidence. So this means part of the ground is subsiding more than another part of the ground. So that's the big problem here. They may start out as small cracks, and you might not even be able to see them, but that crack actually can go all the way down to the water table. They get bigger and they grow wider, and you can see them better because of water flowing across the surface and eroding the sides. So this is a picture taken of a kind of a baby fissure, or at least what we see at the surface of it. This is a really, really incredibly interesting set of photos from Queen Creek. On the left side, this is a picture that was taken on August 9th. And you can see there's some sort of little cracks you can see in the ground. The person standing there in the background is kind of standing along the middle one. There's another one to the right of him, and it looks like maybe another one to the left as well. The picture on the right was taken the very next day. So there was one single heavy rainstorm. This in particular is a monsoon storm that we get during August. And the water came down so fast and so heavy that it was able to, what happens is the water runs across the surface and it hits the side of the fissure, and the water kind of partially goes down into the fissure. It's a nice conduit to get down to the groundwater system. And so it's sort of like a waterfall against the side, and every time it goes over, it erodes back a little bit more, and it opens up really quickly. So the monsoon doesn't cause it, but it makes it wider at the surface for us to see. I believe this particular area of Queen Creek during this particular storm was the one and only death that is recorded for earth fissures. Unfortunately, a horse at one of the ranches out in Queen Creek actually ended up falling in to one of the fissures and started panicking, and they couldn't get it out in time to save it. So what's the big deal? It's a big crack in the ground. The problem is they cause damage, and that gets expensive. So you're looking at property and infrastructure damage. So homes, that particular house in Queen Creek, I know they had some damage to some of their fencing and their storage equipment, pipelines, roads. The 202 actually goes right across one of these fissures, and they have spent a fortune trying to fix it constantly. The canals are a major, major important infrastructure part here in southern Arizona, because that's how we get a lot of our surface water brought to us to supply our municipal needs. You don't want to lose those. And bridges and other property. So, while these don't really kill very much, they do cause a lot of problems. Here's another view of an earth fissure. If you this may or may not have the people standing. There may be some people standing sort of just a little bit above the center of the image next to this fissure. It just gives you sort of an idea of the scale of these things. One kind of interesting fissure is actually out in Apache Junction, right along Houston Avenue. It's a really big fissure that spans a really long way, and it actually crosses under Houston Avenue, or I guess I should say Houston Avenue was built right on top of it. And so I'm going to play a quick video. This is one of the geologists at the Arizona Geologic Survey, who was sent out to look at it because it's failed a couple of times. You can actually see on the road here where it's been patched, and then it started falling in again.
Hi, I'm Joe Cook with the Arizona Geological Survey. It's August 13th, 2018, and I'm in Apache Junction, Arizona. This is Houston Avenue. We got a call from the county that an earth fissure opened underneath the road and damaged the road. And so we're out here checking this out. This is a long-lived fissure. It's been here since at least the 1980s, and it opened in a big way last year, late July of 2017. We were out here, and we have an updated map of this Apache Junction fissure study area. This year, it opened up under the road, and the road is cracked. So we're here to check out the extent, if there's any new fissures, what part of the fissure failed, what part of the road failed. And then the fissure is very visible in the desert to the north. There's some state trust land, and this fissure runs all the way up to Baseline and Meridian. So we're basically out here to do a check on this active portion of the fissure And if we need to, we can update our maps. I'm going to walk back to the active part of the fissure that opened up underneath the road.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Okay, so now we're standing on Houston Avenue, right where the earth fissure intersects the road. So this is to the north. You can see the earthen part of the earth fissure. There's a bunch of desert broom and large vegetation growing along it. It's hard to tell from this vantage point. We'll go up closer in a minute. But this crack extends to depth. It gets pretty narrow. We don't exactly know how deep it goes, but it comes underneath the road. And here's the fix of the road from last year. And basically what we're looking at here is the concrete part of this road is completely undermined. There's no soil or anything underneath it. And the blacktop has fallen in just into the void. So all this material that was underneath this portion of the road has been swallowed into the fissure. So this is the same place that it failed last year. And with a good monsoon storm and interception of a lot of stormwater, the erosion along the fissure has happened again and damaged the road. Whenever you're ready. So we're standing next to the earth fissure north of Houston Avenue. So we're on the portion of the fissure that's between Baseline Road and Houston Avenue. And here we have multiple active fissure strands. There's one to my left, there's two to my right. The drainage in this area wants to run from east to west, and everywhere that these channels intersect the fissure, they cut down in, and so the channels on the east side are very incised, and the channels on the west side are basically abandoned. So all the water that falls in this desert here gets channeled into the fissure, which helps erode it and keep it active. So there's portions of this fissure behind me that are not that deep. You can see the desert broom growing out of there. There's portions to the north that are very deep. They're deep, narrow cracks, probably at least 25, 30 feet deep that we can tell. And then there's other areas that have been temporarily filled in with sediment. And depending on the storm, that can either get flushed down to greater depths or it can fill in the fissure. But generally, this part of the fissure closer to Houston Avenue is pretty active and deep. The portion closer to Baseline and Meridian seems to be more flat-bottomed and filled in. But with the monsoon season, we generally see new fissures forming parallel to old fissures, existing fissures becoming deeper. So this part of the valley still has active fissure processes happening.
All right. I gave you a link that you can get to on the document to actually see how these earth fissures are mapped. It's actually pretty an interesting website. What's kind of funny here is I took the geology club out to go look at these fissures when it was damaged the first time. So this is that exact place he was just at, but you can see it doesn't have the patch in the road yet. So we actually went out while it was broken. I didn't even know it was broken, and we showed up out there, and it was really interesting to get to see that. And so if you look, you can see just sort of how deep we're looking into those cracks on the surface there. We could look like 15, 20 feet down right below us, which was pretty interesting. So here's a map to give you an idea of where this is out there. So here's Houston Avenue, kind of in the middle of the screen, and this big red fissure going up towards Baseline Avenue. That is that fissure, and you can see it actually crosses Baseline and keeps on trucking, but you can see where it crosses Houston and goes under a lot of those businesses there. This is a super kind of industrial part of Apache Junction, but there are buildings that have literally been built on top of the fissures that they were already there that you could see at the surface, and they just plopped a building down there. The one that's kind of almost the saddest and the scariest, though, is when you see the housing developments that are just to the west of here, because there's fissures that go right up there to that Maricopa Pinal County line, and the fissures are over in Pinal County and just sort of magically stop. Yeah, that doesn't happen. They keep on trucking even under all of those homes. And we actually walked down towards some of them to the back wall because they've got the big cinder block walls like everywhere else, and there's big cracks running up the sides of their homes where those fissures cross under there. So this is probably not a great place to to have at home, or even to build your build your business on top of in those areas. All right, so why are these big cracks here? What's causing the earth fissures to happen? Well, remember that we talked about using too much groundwater? This is absolutely because of this. This is groundwater table decline in southern Arizona. Unfortunately, this is up to 1980, but this is like the best map that's been made. Sadly enough, there's not a lot of newer ones. But if you remember, I did give you a link at one point to that interactive map that'll show you the decline in those wells too. But you can see west of Phoenix, down near Chandler Heights in the Picacho Basin, down at Wilcox, out in the Harquahala Plain, these are areas that have had a really significant decline in groundwater, the groundwater table, but these are pretty heavily agricultural areas that require a lot of groundwater to be able to grow crops here in the desert. And we can actually, there are groups that are measuring subsidence. This is one little subsidence area out in the Glendale Peoria Avenue. They're on Northern. That's actually not too far from the World Wildlife Zoo is out that way. So yeah. So those are out there too. But you can see this is less than 3 years worth of time. And parts of this actually subsided by 20 centimeters in less than 3 years. Now, 20 centimeters doesn't sound like a lot, but that's not a very long time period. So yeah, there's a couple of big areas out in the West Valley that has subsidence. This is one of them, and right at Luke Air Force Base is another one. Now, this is done using what is known as INSAR technology. So what happens is they take an airplane and fly over, and they use basically light waves to measure really, really, really carefully the ground topography. And then they go back and they fly the whole thing again and measure the ground surface another time. And then what they do is they look for changes. And that's what this is. INSAR stands for like interferogram, something or other. And so that's a pretty common way to actually measure subsidence. So remember that picture of the dude in Mendota? Here is a dude standing out near Luke Air Force Base. And so between 1957 and 1991, they had about 5.5 meters of elevation change. Now, let me remind you, Luke Air Force Base is an active Air Force base. There is a really big runway out there, and they fly some of those super, super expensive brand new jets out there. And so making sure your runway don't break is probably a really, really big deal for Luke Air Force Base. Remember I mentioned Wilcox as an area that the groundwater use is far, far too high. This shows you an example of where subsidence is happening in this area. And you can see there's some places along like Dragoon Road that has had over 15.7 inches worth of subsidence, and that's just between 2006 and 2015. That's not a very long time to drop that much, which is pretty scary. But wells are running dry. They're using that up too fast, and of course the ground is dropping as well. And if you look down at the bottom, they actually have, or the southern part of this area, they have earth fissures marked right around the edges of the subsidence feature. Here's some other of these shots. This is a really popular way to show subsidence, but on the left is subsidence near Wilcox. That's we were just talking about that. On the right, here is Eloy, another southern Arizona area that's a lot of agricultural area. So that is over 15 feet in just over 30 years too. So you can see it's a widespread problem throughout the Southwest. So if we look through all of southern Arizona, these red blotches are actually the areas that are experiencing subsidence. So all of these areas are places where the ground is dropping. You can see that Wilcox area, obviously, in around Eloy and Picacho Basin. Of course, there's a big drop. The Western Valley has quite a large subsidence feature. And then look, if you look at Mesa, MCC is basically smack dab in the middle of this thing, which is kind of funny. But what that means is there's problems that come along with it. If we go out a little bit further east there, it extends into Gilbert. And I know the little strip mall area where my kids' daycare is, there was a gym that actually closed down. And our daycare director told me they closed down because they couldn't keep the floors from cracking. Like all the tile they would put down on their floors would break constantly because the ground was shifting beneath them. Um, so yeah, this is kind of a big deal here. Now there's a few things I want you to notice about this though, and where these are. What do these places have in common? The West Valley. What's out here? Yeah, those are mountains. And if you look out here, those are mountains, kind of all the way surrounding these. There's the Picacho Mountains that sort of make a barrier here too. Because these subsidence areas only happen in those downdropped basins of the basin and range. So if we look here again, your groundwater aquifers are down in the basins, and you have the mountain ranges on the sides that are pretty much completely devoid of groundwater. So all of our groundwater is mainly in the sediments that make up the basins. Right? So what happens here? I'm gonna show you some pictures here in a second, but this is a pretty nice one. It's about differential compaction and differential subsidence. There's parts of the valley that are subsiding faster than other parts. And it's the transition between those two is where the fissures happen. All right, so here's my cartoon for you. It's a cross section. On the right are the big granity mountains that form the edge of one of our basins of the Basin Range. You can see the brown sediment filling in the basin, and the blue is going to represent the aquifers under there. So you live in Phoenix, you need some water. Let's put in some wells. All right, so we start pumping water out of those wells. One of the first things you're going to notice is cone of depressions forming around those wells because it's really, really dry to grow anything here. You're probably going to need to use more water than can fill back in. But I want you to notice the depth of the aquifer. The aquifer is pretty thick over on the left side. We're out in the middle of the basin. But if you look on the right, that aquifer is pretty thin there because you've got just a little bit of those mountains that are buried and covered in sediment. So as you start getting subsidence in the basin, as the ground's starting to drop, you get compaction out in the basin, but you don't get quite as much over here where the aquifer is a lot thinner. And what happens is you can see it's starting to stretch a little bit, and we're going to open up a big old crack. And so this big crack that forms is basically a tension crack because this part of the ground is being ripped open because the middle of the basin is sinking. And so where you're going to find these earth fissures are going to be sort of on that boundary between the mountain systems and those big subsidence areas. It's going to be right along those boundaries where the earth fissures form. And that's why they're mainly on kind of the outskirts of the valley, down in Queen Creek, along out in AJ, out near Luke Air Force Base because those are right along the mountain fronts. So this is a problem. The biggest problems that come, you can see a list of all the damage that it can cause. Remember, I mentioned Dragoon Road earlier when we were looking at the Wilcox map. There's a big old fissure going right across Dragoon Road. You can see where an irrigation canal has been broken. You can see the earth fissures while they were building the 202 right above it, which was, by the way, a great choice. But you can see there's a lot that can happen here at these earth fissures. So here's some other pictures of damage. This is another place in Queen Creek that's pretty famous. You can see it's right under the fissure crosses into their pens for their animals. I believe they have horses there. Couple of signs warning you of subsidence areas and earth fissures. I think this top left one is from California, but I'm loving that picture of the car like flying into the crack, which is kind of beautiful. So, is there any solution here? We gotta quit using groundwater. And once these were recognized, the very first of the earth fissures were actually recognized quite a while ago. These started back in like the 40s and 50s, but it was a time where Arizona had a lot of growth and a lot of new agriculture coming in. So, of course, they started seeing these big earth fissures form. Once it was sort of recognized what was happening, most of the cities stopped using groundwater to supply water to their to the citizens in the city. That's why we use surface water from the canals, from the rivers. But the agriculture that we grow here in Arizona, when I lived in the West Valley, we had a watermelon farm. They're literally made out of water, and they're growing in the desert. And so that takes a lot of water, and the agriculture is who is still using these groundwater stores.